Please support this channel by subscribing. Your support means everything to us and helps us keep creating stories like this. Cale Dravenmore returned to Crimson Reach Manor without warning, arriving like a shadow that refused to announce itself. Because he did not want welcomes, he did not want questions, and he did not want to face the silence that had lived inside those stone walls for 3 years. Yet the moment he stepped past the iron gate, wrapped in ancient wards, something felt wrong in a way he could not name. The manor was too still, not peaceful, but held, like the air itself was waiting for a verdict. And then he heard it, a sound he had not heard in a long time. Not laughter, not a cry, but a soft little breathy murmur that belonged to children. And it made his entire body go rigid as instinct drove his hand toward the obsidian blade at his side. Because the last time Crimson Reach held the sound of babies, it ended in blood and ashes and a funeral flame that stole the voices of his heirs. He moved through the corridor like a predator moving through fog, his boots silent on the marble, his cloak dragging darkness behind him, and the sound grew clearer with every step. A gentle rhythm, like a lullaby without words, coming from the sunlit hall that no one used anymore. He reached the archway and stopped so abruptly, it was as if time itself grabbed him by the throat. Because there, in the pale spill of moonlight through stained glass, sat a human girl in a plain maid's dress. Blue fabric, white apron, hair tied back with a simple ribbon. And in her arms were his 3 triplets, Riven, Alone, and Thane, pressed against her as if she were the only warm thing in a cold world. Their identical midnight curls fell against her shoulders. Their silver eyes were open, watching her face instead of staring into nothing. And the most impossible detail of all was this: they were calm, not stiff like porcelain statues, not locked in that haunted quiet, but resting, breathing, leaning into her as if trust had grown there naturally. Cale's chest tightened with something sharp and unfamiliar, something dangerously close to hope, and his mind rejected it instantly. Because hope was a cruel thing for kings who had already failed. He had buried hope with Valoria, his queen. The night she died shielding their children from assassins, he had spent fortunes, summoned blood mages, healers, scholars, priests of old covens, and nothing had returned their voices. He had hunted the murderers until his vengeance turned the world red. And still his children stayed silent. So how could a maid be holding them like this? How could she be the one to reach what his power could not? His gaze snapped to her hands, searching for hidden sigils, blades, spells. But she held them with careful gentleness, one arm under their backs, one hand rubbing small circles over Thane's shoulder, like she had done it 1,000 times. And then Riven, the protective one, lifted his small hand and touched the girl's cheek. Not hard, not fearful, but curious. Like a child touching sunlight to confirm it is real, Cale felt the room tilt. Because that movement was not an accident. It was a choice. And it meant his son had decided this human was safe. Anger surged to cover the shock. Cold fury built from the simple fact that someone had entered his family's grief without permission. Yet before he could speak, the girl looked up and met his eyes without flinching. Her face pale but steady, her posture respectful but not broken. And she said in a quiet voice that carried through the hall like a bell in darkness, "My lord, please don't shout. They only just came back to me." And in that moment, the vampire king understood the most terrifying truth of all. His children were not healing because of magic. They were healing because someone finally chose to stay. Asterisk, the hall did not explode into shouting or chaos. It froze instead, as if the ancient stones themselves were waiting to see whether their king would become a storm or a blade. Cale stood there with eyes like carved ice, while the maid slowly and carefully adjusted her hold on the triplets. as though afraid that any sudden movement might break something fragile and invisible. Riven's hand tightened in her sleeve, Alone's head rested against her shoulder, and Thane's small fingers were tangled in the ribbon at her collar. And the sight of that simple human closeness stirred something dangerous in Cale's chest, something he had buried under wars and councils and conquest. He forced his voice to remain cold and controlled as he said, "Explain," and the single word carried the weight of an empire. The girl swallowed, but did not look away. Her name was Ila, she told him, just a maid hired weeks ago. She had not planned for any of this, had not expected anything to change. She had only been told the children were silent and should be left alone. But she knew what it meant to be left alone, and one night she had found herself sitting by their beds, humming a song her mother used to sing, as she had come back the next night. And the next, and somewhere along the way, they had begun to watch her instead of the walls. Cale listened without interrupting, his face unreadable, but every word cut into the careful distance he had built between himself and that nursery. He wanted to dismiss her, to order her removed, to lock the world back into its familiar shape. But then Alone shifted and reached for Ella's sleeve as if sensing danger. And Cale saw something else, not fear, but a plea that had never been spoken. Footsteps echoed in the corridor as Valera and 2 guards arrived, stopping short at the sight before them. Valera's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth, because in 3 years she had never seen the children sit like that with anyone. The guards looked to their king, waiting for the order to separate them, and the staff began to gather, whispers spreading like fire through dry grass. Some called it a trick, some called it a spell. One servant muttered that humans always bring trouble, and another said the maid was trying to secure a powerful position by using the heirs. The words were sharp, and Ila's shoulders stiffened as if she had expected them. Cale felt something old and bitter stir in him. He knew that tone. He had heard it in courts and councils, the sound of judgment passed by those who never carried the cost. He raised a hand and silence fell. Then he turned to the guards and said, "No one touches them," and the words were not loud, but they were final. He ordered Valera to prepare the truth wards, the ancient magic that revealed deception, because if this girl was lying, he would know. And if she was using his children, he would end it himself. Ila nodded when she heard, her face pale but calm, and she gently set the children back on the cushioned bench before standing in front of them like a quiet shield. When the ward was activated, a soft crimson light filled the hall, searching her like a living thing, and the manor itself seemed to hold its breath. But nothing happened, no backlash, no scream, no shadow of falsehood, only a faint warmth that pulsed once and faded. And in that silence, Thane made the smallest sound. Not a word, not a cry, just a soft, broken breath that might have been the beginning of one. And Cale felt his heart crack where it had been stoned for too long, because the magic had judged her innocent. But his son had done something far more dangerous. He had tried to speak, and for the first time in 3 years, the vampire king was afraid not of losing his children, but of what it would mean if he finally let himself believe they could be saved. The change did not announce itself with miracles or celebration. It crept into Crimson Reach the way dawn creeps into a long night, slowly and almost shyly, and yet everyone felt it. The servants whispered more carefully. The guards watched the corridors with new purpose. And Cale found himself standing outside the nursery door more often than he would admit, listening to a silence that was no longer empty but waiting. Ila continued her work as if nothing about her position had changed. She cleaned, she folded, she sang softly when she thought no one important was listening, and she sat with the children in the long hours between sunset and moonrise, never forcing, never demanding. And little by little, the triplets began to respond in ways so small they could be missed by anyone who was not looking with a broken heart. Alone started following Ila's hands with her eyes. Thane stopped flinching at every shadow. And Riven no longer placed himself like a shield at the slightest sound. Kale watched these things from the doorway, telling himself he was only observing for threats. But in truth, he was watching Hope learn how to walk. The staff, however, did not all share his restraint. Some were grateful, some were frightened, and some were resentful, because it is easier to believe in curses than in quiet kindness. And when a raven arrived from the Western Blood Court bearing a formal seal and a gift, the unease in the manner sharpened into something dangerous. The letter was polite, filled with condolences long overdue, and warm words about renewed friendship now that the king had returned. And the gift was a large chest said to contain rare toys and a new nurse skilled in trauma care. Valera's mouth tightened when she read it, because nothing in the blood courts was ever given without a price. Kale ordered the chest opened in the receiving hall, guards present, wards active, and when the lid lifted, there were indeed finely crafted toys and silks, and a woman who bowed low and introduced herself as a healer. Her voice smooth, her smile practiced, but Ila, who had been carrying fresh linens past the hall, stopped as if struck, her eyes fixed on the ribbon tied around one of the boxes, because stitched into its pattern was a tiny symbol she recognized. From a burned village and a winter night she never spoke about. A mark used by the same shadowed network that had once sold information to assassins. Her breath caught, and she felt the past reach for her like a cold hand. She said nothing at first, because she knew what happened to maids who accused nobles. But that night, when she sat with the children and felt Riven's small hand curl into her sleeve as if he sensed her fear, she made a decision. The next morning she went to Valera and told her what she had seen. Valera listened, then took her straight to Kale, who looked at Ila as if weighing whether she was about to bring him truth or chaos. She told him everything she knew about the symbol, about the traitors who used it, about how information flowed through hidden hands, and Kale's eyes darkened. Because the attack that killed his queen had begun with leaked roots and false security, he did not accuse her of lying. But he did not trust the gift either. He ordered the nurse kept away from the children and the chest sealed for inspection. And that evening, as if sensing the tension in the walls, Thane made another small sound in his sleep, and Alone's lips moved as if shaping a word she could not yet remember. And Kale realized something terrifying. The moment his children began to return to the world had begun to reach for them again. And in the shadows of Crimson Reach, old enemies were waking, because hope, like light, has a way of revealing everything that has been hiding. Kale tried to do what he had always done when something precious became vulnerable. He tried to put distance and walls between it and the world, and that meant putting distance between the children and the one person who seemed to be reaching them. He told himself it was for their safety, that if enemies were watching, a human maid would be the weakest link, the easiest target. And so one evening he ordered Valera to assign Ila to another wing of the manor, far from the nursery. And when the order was carried out, the change was immediate and brutal. The triplets did not cry, they did not scream. But the fragile progress they had made collapsed like a bridge made of mist. Riven returned to sitting rigid and watchful. Alone stopped following movement, and Thane would not sleep. He clung to his blanket as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the world. And the nursery filled again with that old, heavy silence that felt like a tomb that was still breathing. Kale stood in the doorway and felt the weight of his own decision crush down on him, because he had seen this before, not in them, but in himself. The way grief closes like a fist when it is frightened, Valera came to him quietly and said what no one else dared. You took away the one thing that made them feel safe. And he had no answer that night, as if fate itself had decided to stop being patient. The Western Court's healer was discovered trying to access the sealed chest, and when guards confronted her, she vanished in a flare of forbidden's magic, leaving behind only ash and the same stitched symbol burned into the stone floor. The threat was no longer distant. It was inside his walls. Cale did not hesitate again. He ordered Illa brought back to the nursery, and the moment she stepped into the room, the children reacted as if a storm had passed. Thane reached for her with shaking hands. Alone's eyes filled with tears she did not yet know how to release, and Riven stood and walked to her, slow and unsteady, and pressed his forehead against her side. And Illa knelt and held them all without speaking, because some reunions are too heavy for words. That was when something even stranger happened. As she rocked them gently, she began to hum an old tune. But the words that slipped out were not the ones her mother had taught her. They were older, shaped by a language she did not recognize yet somehow knew. And the air in the room changed. The wards carved into the walls flared softly like waking stars, and the children stilled, listening, and for the first time, Alone whispered something, not a full word, but a sound that was shaped with intention. Cale felt the world tilt beneath his feet, because he knew that language. It was a royal cradle tongue, an ancient form of speech used by Valoria's bloodline, a language that should not exist in a human memory. He demanded to know how she knew it. And Ella could only tell him the truth, that her mother used to sing strange songs, that her grandmother had called them old protection songs, that she had never understood them. She had only remembered. Cale ordered records brought, and when they searched the old registries, they found it a single broken line of ancestry, a forgotten branch tied long ago to Valoria's house, hidden, diluted, and lost among humans. And he understood then that his queen had not left everything to chance, that she had woven more than one thread of protection around her children. And Illa, who had thought herself ordinary and disposable, was part of that design, not as a weapon, not as a queen, but as a bridge, and for the first time since Valoria's death. The vampire king realized that some safeguards are not built from power, but from people who are meant to arrive exactly when they are needed. Asterisk, the revelation did not bring peace. It brought attention, and in the immortal realms attention was far more dangerous than ignorance. Word began to move through the blood courts that the silent heirs were changing, and that a human maid was somehow involved. And wherever rumors went, ambition followed. The Western Court was not the only one watching, and soon a formal summons arrived for Cale to present his heirs before the Blood Council under the pretense of celebration for his return. Valera read the letter and said what they were all thinking. This is a test. And Cale agreed, because councils did not gather for joy. They gathered to measure weakness. He did not want to take the children, but refusing would only feed the idea that something was wrong with them. So he prepared to go, and when Illa learned the children were to be shown before a hall full of ancient predators, she felt fear coil in her stomach, but she did not ask to stay behind, because Riven had begun to look for her whenever he was frightened. And Thane would not sleep without her sitting nearby. The council hall was a cathedral of stone and shadow, filled with nobles who smiled like knives, and when Cale entered with his heirs, silence fell, followed by whispers, and then by questions dressed as concern. One lord suggested that children who had been silent for 3 years might not be fit to inherit. Another said that perhaps they needed to be temporarily placed under the care of a more stable court, and the words were polite, but the hunger beneath them was not. Ella stood behind the children, her hands resting lightly on their shoulders, feeling how they trembled, and when one noble laughed softly and called her a servant who had grown delusions of importance, something inside her steadied instead of breaking. She stepped forward, her voice quiet but clear, and said that the Western Court's gift had been a trap, that the same network which killed the queen was still trading in secrets, and that there was a traitor among them. The hall erupted into mockery, because accusations from a human maid meant nothing, until Kale raised his hand and allowed her to place the burned ribbon and the marked ash before the council. Then he added something only he could say, that he had traced the same symbol to sealed records and intercepted messengers. And that someone in this room had opened the first door to the assassins 3 years ago. The laughter died, eyes began to shift, and one noble stood too quickly, too eagerly, and in that moment the truth was visible even before guards moved. The traitor was taken, and the council learned a lesson they had forgotten. That underestimating quiet people was often fatal. When the session ended, the decision was made in full view of the realm. The heirs were declared fit, and no court would lay claim to them. But as Kale turned to leave, he heard one last whisper, "You trust a human too much." And he answered without looking back, "I trust results." The journey home was silent but lighter, and that night, in the nursery, something happened that none of them had dared to expect. As Ella sat between the beds and hummed, alone said her name, not perfectly, not loudly, but clearly enough to make Valera drop the tray she was carrying and to make Kale's breath leave him like he had been struck. Riven did not speak, but he smiled. And Thane laughed, a soft, broken sound that was still the most beautiful noise the manor had heard in years. And in that moment, the entire realm began to understand that the weakest person in the room had just changed the fate of a kingdom. The night did not end in celebration, because fate rarely allows joy to stand without testing it. And as Crimson Reach slept under a quiet sky, the one traitor who had been taken was not the only threat that had been uncovered. Others had been waiting for a better moment. And that moment came when the inner wards flickered like dying stars and then went dark. Kale felt it from across the manor, a wrongness that echoed in his blood. And he was already moving before the alarms began. But by the time he reached the nursery, the beds were empty and the windows were open to the cold night air. And for a single, terrible second, the world became exactly what it had been 3 years ago. Ela stood frozen in the doorway, her heart breaking in a way she thought she would not survive. But then she saw something on the floor, a small silver thread woven with the same ancient pattern she had been singing. And she knew the children were not gone without a trail. They were being taken somewhere that remembered their mother. Beneath the manor, in the old tunnels that predated even the blood courts. Kale did not tell her to stay behind. He did not argue. He only said, "Stay close to me." And that was a promise as much as an order. The tunnels were narrow and heavy with old magic, and shadows moved in ways that did not obey light. But Ela walked forward anyway, following the faint pull she felt in her chest. The same pull that had guided her hands when she sang to the children. They found the attackers in a forgotten chamber where Valoria had once hidden her most dangerous secrets. And the enemies were not soldiers, they were remnants. Desperate creatures who believed that if they controlled the heirs, they could control the future. A fight followed, fast and brutal. But Kale did not let it become a slaughter, because Ila was there, and because he had learned something about the kind of king he wanted to be. When it was over, the children were found in a circle of broken wards, frightened but unharmed, and Thane reached for Ila the moment he saw her. And she dropped to her knees and held them all, shaking, as Kale stood guard like a wall that would never move again. When dawn came, the realm heard what had happened, and the message was clear. The heirs were not unprotected, and the woman beside them was not disposable. Days later, in the Great Hall, Kale made a declaration that stunned both nobles and servants. Ila was no longer just a maid. She was named the children's guardian under royal protection, answerable to no court but the throne. And when someone asked what claim a human had to such a place, Kale answered simply, "She earned it by staying when others fled." Life did not become a fairy tale after that, but it became something better, something honest. The children continued to learn how to speak and laugh, slowly, in their own time. And Kale began to be present, not as a distant ruler, but as a father who sat on the floor and listened. And sometimes, in the quiet evenings, he and Ela would sit in the same room without speaking. And the silence would no longer hurt. It would simply be full. And something unspoken and gentle would grow there. Not rushed, not claimed, but allowed. Because both of them had learned what it meant to lose, and what it meant to choose to stay. And so the vampire king finally understood the lesson his queen had tried to teach